My name is Fernando. I'm a postdoc at Simon Levin's lab at Princeton University. And here I would like to present you something about this question. How complex should a social norm be to promote cooperation? And I'm going to present this in the context of indirect reciprocity, which is a topic familiar to many people here. So some of the first papers were written by Robert Boyd. Joe also mentioned that negative indirect reciprocity today. So in a way, when he alluded to the cognitive requirements in negative indirect reciprocity, in a way this is framed in this idea of cognitive requirements for indirect reciprocity. So maybe there are some connections. So what I'm going to show you first is that indirect reciprocity is a potential mechanism to justify cooperation, altruistic cooperation. And indirect reciprocity suggests that if individuals cooperate today, then others may know about this and cooperate back in the future, which provides some indirect benefits for cooperation. So we need some information about what individuals did in the past. So if you wish, we need reputations. And here, the way that reputations are going to be attributed depend on social norms, which in this context are just rules defining what's a good or a bad action and in which context. So we are going to see that norms can become complex if we allow them to include more information about the history of individuals. I'm going to show you a possible way of quantifying the complexity of these norms. And finally, I'm going to show that we can have simple norms and yet very high levels of cooperation. Okay. So first of all, what do I mean by cooperation? So in very simple terms, we can say that cooperation occurs when an individual pays a cost to provide a benefit to other individuals. So this is altruistic cooperation. And I'm assuming that the benefits are larger than the costs, which means that in a population, if everyone cooperates, the sum of the payoffs in the society increases, we obtain the social optimum. However, because it involves a cost, a defector will always be in a better position than a cooperator. So if you think about a population where individuals are somehow adopting the strategies that maximize their payoff, or if you think about natural selection, our prediction is that we will end up with defection, as you know. Now, the fact is that in reality, we see many examples of cooperation. So now a very old question is, how can you justify that we see so many examples of this altruistic cooperation? And one possible justification has to do with reputations and reciprocity. So if somehow individuals can access some information about the previous interactions of their opponents, then if they reciprocate cooperation, if they reward cooperation, then cooperation can have an indirect benefit to evolve. And this is the idea underlying indirect reciprocity, which is a widely studied topic since the 80s, both theoretically and with experiments. So, there's some link between reputations and cooperation. However, to fully understand this connection, we must answer a very old question, which is, who should be considered good in order for cooperation to evolve in these populations? How should we attribute reputations? And this is where we introduce social norms. So a norm here defines what's a good or a bad action, as I was mentioning you. So let me be more specific. So let's say that individual A is deciding to cooperate or defect with individual B. Then after this interaction, individual A will have a new reputation being attributed. It will have an update in the reputation. And this next reputation will depend, that we will represent here in this outer ring, will depend on the action of A, that I represent here in this middle ring. So orange, cooperate, gray, defect. And will also depend on the reputation of B, either good or bad. So we can think about one norm saying that everyone that cooperates will have a good reputation. Okay? Or we can be more specific and say that only those that cooperate with the good will have a good reputation, all else is considered bad. So these are the so-called second-order norms. They are relying on two pieces of information, one action and one reputation. But we can include more information. We can include also the information about the reputation of the donor. These would be the third-order norms, relying on three pieces of information. So with these, we can write rules such as, if an individual behaves in a certain way, he or she can maintain his or her reputation. Or we can introduce more information. We can also think about the previous reputation of the opponent, so the reputation that resulted from the second last interaction. And this will allow us to be more specific. We can say now that an individual will have a certain reputation when cooperates with someone that is both good now and was good in the past, and so on. And notice that despite the fact that we are considering binary reputations, now the information that we have associated in an individual is not binary anymore, because now we can distinguish between those that are both good now and were good in the past from those that are good now, but in the past had a different reputation. And also notice that we are increasing exponentially the space of norms that we can consider. So now we can have more than 65,000 possible norms. Okay, so we have thousands of norms. And now the goal is to associate with each of these norms a level of cooperation. Okay? So to do this, we can consider a population of individuals where each individual has a reputation. And on top of the reputation, individuals will also have a strategy, an action rule. So this is what tells the individual either to cooperate or defect, depending on the reputation of the opponent. Here, I'm only going to exemplify this with the second order strategies that only rely on the reputation of the opponent. So we are considering the full set of strategies. So following Arn's presentation of yesterday, we are considering a fair strategy set. We are considering all possible strategies, assuming that reputations are binary. Okay, so in second order, we can have individuals that are all C, always cooperate. Okay. We can have individuals that are all D, always defect. We can have the discriminators, or this strange strategy of PDs, that stands for paradoxical discriminator, of cooperating with the bad and defecting with the good. Okay. So then, from time to time, we can select pairs of individuals and have these individuals playing many rounds so that they can accumulate a payoff and have their reputations updated. And of course, they will decide to cooperate or defect depending on the reputations involved and depending on the action that they are adopting at a given moment in time. And then the reputations are going to be updated after each interaction depending on the norm that we fix in a population. And the final assumption is that the strategies that are accumulating more payoff are going to spread faster in the population. Okay. So this is the general blueprint of the model. Then we can discuss other details afterwards, and I'm not going to be more specific here. Just let me just give you an idea for how can we study this model. So we can, for example, calculate the fixation probabilities between pairs of strategies. So what's the probability that one strategy fixates in a population previously composed by another strategy? And this will allow us to under this small mutation approximation, calculate all the fixation probabilities and define a Markov chain that will allow us to have a...
How is reputation updated? How do people learn about the reputations?
So yes, okay, so here we assume that reputations, there can be some errors, but all the population will know about the reputation. Yeah. Yeah. And then we assume that's a probability that there is some error, some private errors, but in general, it will be automatic. We're just focusing on what's the role of each norm, not on the diffusion of reputations itself. Okay. Okay, so this is an approach that Arn also mentioned yesterday, the small mutation approximation. With this, we can be a bit more analytic. We can also simulate. We can iteratively select one individual, having this individual playing many times, select the second individual, have the individual playing many times, accumulating payoff, and then when we limitate the other with a probability that depends on their payoffs differences. Okay. Okay, so regardless the method, the idea, let me just summarize again. So the idea is that we are fixing a norm in a population. This means that different strategies will be associated with different reputations, which means that different strategies will gather more payoff, which means in the end that depending on the frequencies of strategies that we will have different levels of cooperation. So in the end, we are able to establish this link between a social norm and a level of cooperation as we wanted. So what we did was to simulate the dynamics of strategy adoption under every possible fourth order norm. So again, the fourth order norms are those that can include the past reputation of an individual, of receiver, the reputation of the donor, the current reputation of the receiver, and the action of the donor. So here we are representing these norms in this tabular form. So the norm will go here, is an assignment of reputation to every possible situation. So we can have a lot of norms, a lot of strategies in this case, 256 strategies. And the first conclusion that we had was that, well, if we look to cooperation in all norms, then only a very small set of them will promote very high levels of cooperation. So here I'm showing you the histogram with the number of norms or the frequency of norms that promote more than a certain level of cooperation. So here we have the cooperation rate. Here we have the fraction of norms that promotes more than a certain level of cooperation. So 100% of norms will promote more than zero cooperation. which makes sense. Then if we look for the norms that promote more than 60% of cooperation, then only like 20% of norms promote these. So if we look to the norms that promote more than 90% of cooperation, we'll only find 0.2% of these norms. Okay, so this is the first conclusion. Only a very small set of norms promotes very high levels of cooperation. And now the question is, can we still somehow distinguish between these norms? And we can if we look to their complexity, as we will see. So here I'm showing you two examples of norms. And by looking to norms in this form, we cannot tell much about how simple or how complex they are. We know that both of these norms promote more than 90% of cooperation. But if we look carefully for the meaning of these norms, then we can realize that norm 1 is telling that an individual is good if cooperates with an enduring good. So enduring good, someone that is good now and was good in the past. Or an individual is already good and cooperates with someone that is good, or is bad and effects against someone that is good but was bad in the past, or is good and effects against someone that is bad. Whereas norm 2 is saying that an individual is good if cooperates with someone good or effects with someone bad. So intuitively, there's the difference in the complexity of these two norms. And now the challenge is to somehow quantify this intuitive complexity. So we got inspired in the work of 2000 by Jacob Feldman that was looking for how easy or how hard is for individuals to learn Boolean concepts. So Boolean concepts are concepts that can be defined by a set of Boolean variables. Let's say that I have here an object that can be small or big, black or white, a triangle or a square. And the conclusion is that a relatively good heuristic to know if the concept is easy or hard to understand, to learn, is to translate a concept to a logic formula, minimize this formula, count the number of literals, and the more literals the formula has, the more difficult it is for this concept to be learned. So it was a lot of jargon. I will exemplify this now with a norm. That was a lot of jargon, that's right. So let's see this applied to the context of our norm. So here I have one example of norm. So the first step is to translate this norm to a logic formula. So we can think of a norm as a rule, a logic rule, that when evaluated to true, will assign a good reputation. Okay? And this norm will have 4 different variables. So P, the previous reputation of the receiver, S, the reputation of the donor, A, the actual reputation of the receiver, and C, the action of the donor. So we assume that G is good and cooperate is true, bad and D is false. Bad and defect is false. Okay? So this norm will assign a good reputation when P, S, A, and C are all true variables, are either good or cooperate. Okay? So we have here one term that has 4 literals. So a literal is one of these variables. So this term has 4 literals. So P, S, A, and C, because all of these need to be true in order for this norm to assign a good reputation. And this norm assigns a good reputation if this is true, or, so this is the logic disjunction, this is a or, logic or if P and S are true, B and C, A and C are false. So this is the logic negation. Okay? So we repeat this to all the bits where our norm prescribes a good reputation, and we will end up with this giant formula. And then we need to simplify this formula to obtain a minimal one. And then we can do this with well-known methods. And then in the end, we will obtain a formula that is minimal. And by counting the number of literals in this minimized form, we can have an intuition for how easy or how simple or how complex is a norm. So in the context of our example, we can see that this norm can be translated to a formula like this. So each of these is a literal, is a logic variable that can be true or false. So this one will have 13 literals. This norm 2 will have 4 literals. So we can say that this norm has a complexity of 13, and this norm will have a complexity of 4. So we can quantify the intuition that we had previously about the complexity of these norms. So if we repeat this to all possible norms that we have, all thousands of norms that we had, then we can classify these norms in terms of their complexity and in terms of the cooperation that they allow for. So here what I'm showing you on the horizontal axis is the complexity levels, and on the vertical axis we have cooperation rates. So this plot is showing for each level of complexity what's the maximal cooperation that we can obtain. Okay. So first, if we have norms that are extremely simple, these are the norms saying that everyone is good or everyone is bad. These are very simple norms that, however, do not allow for high levels of cooperation. And then we can continue. We can have here a very well-known norm called image score that says that whoever cooperates is good, whoever defects is bad. Still very simple, and we obtain slightly more levels of cooperation. And then we can continue until we reach these norms with a complexity of 4. And after that, even if we increase the complexity of norms, even if we consider norms that are much more complex, we don't obtain significantly higher levels of cooperation. So we can apply this, and so notice what we are doing here is going from these binary strings that usually are used to formulate these norms and strategies, and translate this to a logic formula and count the number of literals. And we can apply this reasoning not only to norms, but also to strategies. And with this, we can have a sense of what's the strategic complexity that a norm allows for in a given population. Okay? So remember that we fixed one norm, we let strategies evolve, so we will have different strategies with different frequencies in our population. Each of these strategies will have a complexity value, so we can obtain a value for the average complexity, every strategic complexity that the norm is implementing in the population, let's say. So here on the each of these points corresponds to a norm. Okay? So here on the horizontal axis we have the average strategic complexity that the norm imputes in a population. And here on the vertical axis, we have the cooperation level. So ideally, we would like to have norms promoting, well, simple behaviors and a lot of complexity, but we can see that there's a trade-off. In order to obtain the maximal levels of cooperation, we need some strategic complexity. But yet again, once we reach this level, we can have norms that promote higher levels of cooperation with behaviors that are more complex. Okay, so I still have some time, 2 minutes, okay, which is nice to summarize. So we've seen here, we started from indirect reciprocity as a mechanism to justify, in a way, cooperation in pairwise interactions in specific domains. And then we've seen that there's a way of quantifying the complexity associated with norms and strategies in the context of indirect reciprocity. Also, this represents a process, if you wish, an algorithm that can be used in other domains, in direct reciprocity, in any situation where you can describe your strategies with binary strings, basically. And then we've seen that we can have a simple norm promoting very high levels of cooperation. As curiosity, this norm, Stern judging, is saying that an individual is good if cooperates with the good and defects with the bad. So it has a complexity 4, and it's highly successful. We can also show that this norm works well both in small and in large populations. So this represented also something original. So a lot of works on indirect reciprocity assumed infinitely large populations. If we assume that populations are finite, then we will have stochastic effects, and the population size will have an impact on the cooperation rate under different social norms. So we can see that this norm works well both in small and in large populations, and it also works well if we assume that reputations are costly to share. Okay? So far we assume that reputations simply exist. Okay? There's an interaction, and then reputations will be updated automatically. However, in reality, sharing something about someone can be a costly act. So nowadays, if you think about writing a review on Amazon or eBay, it takes time and effort to share your opinion. And if you assume that there's a cost associated with sharing reputations, then we can have second-order free-riding problems, meaning that if no one is willing to share reputations, then the system of indirect reciprocity can collapse, and we won't have cooperation in the end. One possible way out of this is to assume that individuals can somehow anticipate the reporting intentions of their opponents. If I know that my opponent will somehow report, and I might feel tempted to be nice with this guy. And this way, both the reporting intentions and the cooperation can both co-evolve. Okay, so this is all. This was a joint work with Francisco Santos and with Jorge Pacheco in Portugal. And thank you very much for your attention.
So what are you assuming about errors in the model?
Okay.
Are they execution errors? Are they perception errors?
Okay.
What's the rate?
Okay, so we are assuming 3 kinds of errors. Private assessment errors. So when an individual needs to assess the reputation of someone, either to attribute, for a new reputation to be attributed or for deciding about an action that can be an error. We have execution errors. So an individual may be willing to cooperate, but because he doesn't have time or have money, he can't. And we are also assuming assessment errors. So when a reputation is attributed, this reputation can be attributed with an error, so everyone will have the wrong image about this individual. Private assessment, which is when you access, and the other is when you. And
what was the rate?
1%. But we tested for, I mean, at least for the most important norms, let's say, we tested for different ranges, and the conclusion remain the same. But the effect of errors on different norms is also quite interesting, and it tells different stories. You can have norms that profit from errors. You can have norms where cooperation is reduced to errors.
The first kind of error will lead to, Martin has, for example, pass through the whole population, creating misunderstandings about disagreements about reputation. You don't see it.
We don't see, so he has a very recent work, assuming directly that there's an image matrix, and when you assume these, the work argues that there could be some mismatches in reputations, and I also say that, well, there's no any kind of synchronization mechanism here that could lead to a synchronization in these reputations. So we don't observe these with these errors, but we are not explicitly considering that there's a reputation matrix, let's say. So when there's a private assessment error, we will not have disagreements in the population about the effect of this error, basically.
We need to talk.
Okay.
I can't understand that, but that's
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't understand most of that, but the simple rule, I think I understood. Good if cooperates with good and defects with bad. Is that right?
Yeah.
So are you mathematically recapitulating in-group, out-group dynamics? It seems like that kind of rule would lead to in-groups and out-groups.
Perhaps. Well, I didn't see it. I think it would be interesting if it would lead to in-groups and out-groups. What you can see with this norm is that for this particular norm, you have two stable states. Not in this group. So when you assume that norms are only of second order, we did a more detailed analysis, and you can see that with this norm, you have two very stable, highly cooperative states where the idea of good and bad is shifted. So you can have a situation where everyone is good, everyone cooperates with good, everyone keeps the good label. You can have the situation where everyone is bad, everyone cooperates with the bad, and everyone keeps the bad label. So you have this coordination in terms of the meaning of reputation.
Thank you.
Short one?
Okay, so just curious, with the more complex reputational assessment strategies,
Yeah.
that would seem to me to want to increase your error rates. So the more complex, more things you have to go through, each compound the errors. Did you consider that?
Yeah, that's so. I would have to see that there's so there's this journey that is simple. There's one that is just one level of complexity higher, and which is the judging, and it seems to work slightly better when there are some more errors. And the history is similar to comparing tit for tat with tit for two tats, where tit for two tat may work well when there are more errors. So the reasoning is similar. So you are completely right. Yeah.